On October 27, 2018, the air in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and impending winter. It was a typical Saturday, the kind that draws enthusiasts to the high country for one last communion with nature before the snows descend. For Gary and Michael, both seasoned outdoorsmen in their late 30s, this weekend promised a challenging but familiar ascent of Mount Sneffels, a formidable 14,158-foot peak known for its jagged, almost alien beauty. They were not novices. Their backpacks, meticulously packed, contained satellite phones, GPS devices, emergency bivy bags, and enough dehydrated meals to last a week. Every item had a purpose, a place. They were the expert victims, individuals whose preparation ironically deepens the mystery of their fate. Their last confirmed contact was a text message sent by Gary to his wife at 7:02 a.m. on October 27th, simply stating, "On the trail, clear skies, see you Sunday, no signal, no trace." Just silence after that. When Sunday, October 28th, passed without their return and repeated calls went straight to voicemail, a familiar dread began to settle. The initial search efforts were swift, involving local SAR teams, helicopters, and K-9 units. The weather, initially clear, had begun to shift, bringing with it the capricious nature of high-altitude autumn. Snow flurries, light at first, gradually intensified, erasing tracks, obscuring landmarks, and effectively swallowing the vast, unforgiving landscape. The search continued for weeks, then months, becoming a grim testament to human endurance against an indifferent wilderness. Their parked truck, a silver Ford F-150, remained undisturbed at the trailhead parking lot, a silent sentinel to their vanishing. Inside, a detailed itinerary lay on the dashboard outlining their planned route, up the standard southwest ridge, summit, then a descent via the more technical Lavender Col. The vehicle was a time capsule of their intent. A half-eaten bag of trail mix, a worn map marked with their intended path, and an older flip phone, unused for the trip, were cataloged by investigators. Each item was mundane yet imbued with the weight of unanswered questions. Why this mountain? Why this descent? The mountains, it seemed, offered no explanations. 5 years later, in the late summer of 2023, the mountains began to yield their secrets, not through confession but through accidental revelation. A lone hiker, off-trail in a remote, little-traveled basin approximately 3 miles north of the Lavender Col, stumbled upon a glint of orange. It was a backpack, weathered and torn, partially buried under a rock overhang. Its material, once vibrant, was now faded by years of sun and snow. The discovery was reported and a small forensic team was dispatched to the coordinates. The scene was meticulously documented, photographs taken from every angle, GPS readings logged. The backpack itself was a relic, a testament to time's relentless erosion. The main compartment was ripped, scattering some of its contents, but several items remained, preserved by the natural refrigeration of the high-altitude environment. Inside, among the debris, were 2 empty water bottles, a slightly corroded multi-tool, and a laminated map, eerily similar to the one found in their truck, but this one marked with a red X on a completely different, unlisted peak, approximately 2 miles east of Sneffels summit. The most significant find, however, was a small rugged action camera, a GoPro Hero 7 tucked into a side pocket. Its casing was scratched, its lens cloudy with mineral deposits, but the on button remarkably still offered resistance. A forensic image of the SD card was immediately created back at the regional lab. The data, if retrievable, represented the last known moments of Gary and Michael. The digital archaeology began. The SD card, a tiny slab of silicon, held the potential to transform abstract tragedy into visceral experience. Initial analysis revealed several corrupted files, the result of years of exposure and power fluctuations. But amidst the digital noise, a sequence of videos, time-stamped, emerged. The first few clips were unremarkable: sunrise over a mountain ridge, a sweeping panorama of the San Juans, Michael adjusting his backpack, Gary offering a thumbs up to the camera. These were the mundane, The routine, the confident preamble of experienced climbers. The audio was clear, crisp, punctuated by their easy banter, the crunch of boots on scree, and the whistling wind. At 8:19 a.m. on October 27th, a video timestamp confirmed Gary and Michael were nearing the summit of Mount Sneffels. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue. Their voices, though slightly breathless from the exertion, conveyed a sense of accomplishment. "Almost there, Mike. What a view," Gary said, panning the camera across the vast expanse of peaks and valleys. Then a subtle shift. At 8:31 a.m., the wind picked up noticeably, the audio crackling with its force. Michael pointed to the east. "Looks like a squall coming in, G-fast." The camera zoomed in, showing a distant, rapidly darkening cloud formation. It was unexpected, unforecasted. The rule of irony. Their preparedness for clear weather was now their vulnerability. They reached the summit at 8:45 a.m. The customary photos were taken, the elation evident on their wind-chapped faces. But the earlier concern about the weather had intensified. The horizon was now a bruised purple, and the wind howled with a new, aggressive intensity. "We need to get down," Michael stated, his voice devoid of its earlier lightness. "This isn't good." The camera, now held by Michael, captured Gary checking his satellite phone. No signal. Not surprising for the deep San Juan troughs, but concerning given their exposure on the summit. The descent began not down the planned Lavender Col, but a more direct, steeper gully to the northeast, an uncharacteristic deviation for such meticulous planners. At 9:15 a.m., the first snowflakes began to fall, fat and wet, quickly turning to a stinging hail. The visibility plummeted. The wind became a physical assault, buffeting them, making conversation nearly impossible. The footage became disorienting, a blur of gray and white. Their pace quickened, almost a scramble. "Can't see the markers?" Gary yelled, his voice strained against the gale. The red X on the found map, marking an unnamed peak 2 miles east, began to resonate with chilling implications. Did they misread their position in the whiteout? Did they take a desperate, ill-advised shortcut? The mountains don't explain why. The video at 9:38 a.m. captured a critical moment. Michael, breathing heavily, slipped on a patch of ice-covered rock. The camera tumbled, recording a chaotic spin of sky and stone before landing face down in the snow. The audio continued, a muffled stream of curses, the rasp of gear scraping against rock, and then a sharp cry from Michael. "My leg! I think it's broken!" The camera, still recording, showed only a distorted view of snow and blurry rock. Gary's voice was urgent, panicked. "Hold on, don't move." The sound of frantic movement, the rustle of fabric, then Gary's voice again, closer to the camera. "Can you move it? Just a little?" A pained groan from Michael. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the relentless wind and the increasing intensity of the snowfall. The timestamp flickered, 9:47 a.m. The next hour of footage was a grim testament to their desperate struggle. The camera remained mostly stationary, recording snippets of frantic activity. Gary trying to splint Michael's leg with trekking poles and an emergency blanket. His labored breathing, the growing sense of futility in his voice. The sat phone, still nothing, no signal. We're too deep in this gully. At one point, Gary came into view, his face etched with exhaustion and despair. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes wide and unseeing, as if staring into the abyss of their predicament. "We're stuck. The storm. It's too much." He moved out of frame again, the sound of him shouting Michael's name, the reply weak and distant. "Hypothermia's setting in, Mike. Stay awake." The battery indicator on the camera, a small digital overlay, showed 1 bar. The image quality degraded further, becoming grainy, almost monochromatic. At 10:55 a.m., the camera picked up a faint rhythmic thumping sound, growing steadily louder. A helicopter? Hope, sharp and desperate, surged through the audio. Gary's voice, hoarse with cold, yelled, "Over here! We're here!" The thumping grew louder, filling the audio track, but no light, no discernible shape appeared in the swirling whiteout. Then, as quickly as it came, the sound faded, consumed by the storm. Gary's voice, a broken whisper, "They can't see us. They can't hear us." The crushing weight of that realization hung heavy in the air. The cruel irony of their extensive preparation, now rendered moot by the sheer overwhelming power of the mountain. The final segments of the recording were the most unsettling. The timestamps jumped, indicating intermittent recording, likely due to low battery or Gary attempting to conserve power. At 1:37 p.m., the camera briefly captured Michael, huddled against a rock, his eyes closed, face pale and covered in frost. He was no longer responding to Gary's urgent pleas. Gary, visibly weaker, struggled to cover him with the emergency blanket, his movements slow and uncoordinated. The wind howled relentlessly, a mournful dirge. The last functional timestamp on the video was 2:03 p.m. The camera, seemingly dropped or placed down, recorded only the relentless blizzard, a swirling vortex of white, and the faint rhythmic creaking of ice. Then, silence, an abrupt, definitive silence. The data stream ended. The void had swallowed them whole. The digital forensics team stared at the final frames, a collective ache settling in the sterile lab. The mountains keep their secrets until they decide not to. The recovery of the GoPro was only the beginning of a deeper, more unsettling forensic journey into the final hours of Gary and Michael. While the digital files provided a chronological skeleton of their ordeal, the physical evidence found at the secondary site, the basin 3 miles north of their intended path, began to paint a picture of a psychological unraveling. Investigators returning to the scene in the summer of 2023 discovered more than just the orange backpack. Scattered within a 50-yard radius were items that suggested a systematic shedding of gear, a phenomenon often associated with the late stages of hypothermia known as paradoxical undressing, yet this was different. The items weren't clothes, they were tools. A high-end GPS unit was found wedged into a rock crevice, its screen intentionally smashed. A secondary satellite communicator was discovered submerged in a seasonal meltwater pool, its battery housing pried open. These were the lifelines of the expert victim, discarded not by accident but by a deliberate, if delusional, hand. Why would they destroy the very things that could save them? The reconstruction of their narrative truth requires us to look past the hardware and into the fraying logic of the human mind under extreme duress. At 2:14 p.m. on that final day, the metadata of the smashed GPS suggests the last coordinates it ever processed were not on Mount Sneffels at all, but hovering over a vertical drop-off known as the Black Gash, a feature notorious for magnetic anomalies and GPS drift. Imagine standing on that precipice, the world a blinding curtain of white, your instruments telling you that you are walking on flat ground while your feet find only the empty air of a 1,000-foot fall. The expert relies on his tools, but when the tools lie, the expert is the first to perish. The grieving investigators, proxy for a public obsessed with the why, spent months overlaying the GoPro's audio peaks with topographical wind speed maps. They discovered that the rhythmic thumping heard at 10:55 a.m., the sound Gary mistook for a rescue helicopter, was likely an atmospheric phenomenon called a mountain wave, where high-velocity winds compress through the canyon generate a low-frequency pulse that mimics the throb of rotors. The cruelty of hope is a powerful sedative. Gary's cries for help were directed at a ghost made of air and pressure. By 3 p.m., the temperature in the basin would have plummeted to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill factor making it feel like minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. In these conditions, the blood retreats from the extremities to protect the core, leaving the brain oxygen-starved and prone to vivid, terrifying hallucinations. Forensic pathologists call it the terminal burrowing phase. Victims in the final throes of freezing often experience an ancestral urge to hide, to crawl into small, cramped spaces where they feel safe. But for Gary and Michael, the evidence suggests they weren't hiding from the cold. The way their remaining gear was arranged, in a tight, defensive circle, suggests they were hiding from something they thought they saw in the storm. The mountains don't explain why, but the evidence logs show a pattern of behavior that defies simple environmental death. A journal fragment found in Gary's inner jacket pocket, protected from the moisture by a Ziploc bag, contained a single shaky entry dated October 27th, 4:12 p.m. It didn't mention the cold. It didn't mention the broken leg. It read, "It has been following the sound of the GoPro. We have to keep it off." This mundane piece of plastic, the camera, was no longer a tool for memory. In Gary's dying mind, it had become a beacon for an imagined predator. The forensic casual analysis of the site suggests that the impossible discovery of the backpack 5 years later wasn't due to snowmelt alone. The backpack had been placed on top of a prominent boulder as if it were an offering or a marker long after the storm had passed. Yet there were no tracks in the 2018 snow that led away from that spot. Just the silence, just the void. The reconstruction continues to haunt the investigators because it suggests that the most dangerous element in the wilderness isn't the terrain or the weather, but the stories we tell ourselves when the lights go out. We look at the macro shots of the rust on the GoPro's mounting bracket and see the passage of time, but we cannot see the moment the logic broke. We are left with the evidence log, one empty flare gun, 3 unused matches, and a map with a red X that leads to nowhere. Why would they do this? The question loops, unanswered, an open wound in the historical record of the San Juans. Justice through memory requires us to acknowledge that even the most prepared among us are only one equipment failure, one phantom sound, one degree of body temperature away from the unknown. The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes they ensure we keep them too. The investigation turned its focus toward the black gash. This geological scar, a vertical fissure cutting through the quartz latite of the northern ridge, became the focal point for the grieving investigators. At 4:45 p.m. on the day of the disappearance, the thermal imaging data from the initial, failed 2018 search was reanalyzed using modern algorithmic enhancement. The results were chilling. A heat signature, faint and pulsating, had been captured near the lip of the gash, but it was dismissed at the time as a thermal bleed from exposed rock. Under the lens of 2026 forensic imaging, the signature revealed a distinct bipedal silhouette huddled against the wind. It was solitary. It was stationary. It was precisely where the GPS metadata indicated Gary had stood after Michael's movement ceased. Imagine the isolation of that moment. The expert victim, stripped of his companion and his certainty, standing at the edge of a literal and metaphorical abyss. The mountains don't explain why Gary left the shelter of the rock overhang to stand in the maw of the storm. The forensic recovery team in 2024 utilized heavy lift drones to descend into the gash itself, a place where no human foot had trod in recorded history. At a depth of 400 feet, caught on a jagged outcropping of iron-stained rock, they found the evidence of the impossible. It was Michael's climbing helmet. It was not shattered from a fall. It was neatly placed, chin strap buckled, sitting level on a shelf of stone no wider than a handspan. No signal, no trace, just a phantom arrangement of safety gear. This discovery violated the laws of traumatic descent. A falling body does not leave a perfectly leveled helmet on a mid-wall ledge. The open loop question shifted from how they died to how their belongings were being curated. Why would a dying man, or the mountain itself, arrange these items with such clinical precision? The language of the landscape is often written in debris, but here it was written in order. At 5:30 p.m. on that final day in 2018, the GoPro, according to its internal clock, was briefly activated one last time. There was no image, only audio. The sound was not the wind. It was the rhythmic metallic clicking of the multi-tool being opened and closed over and over. Click, slide, snap. A mundane sound of a tool being toyed with in the dark. Gary's voice, a mere rasp, whispered a single name. Michael. But Michael was 3 miles away in the basin. The acoustic reconstruction suggests Gary was speaking to someone standing inches from the lens. The rule of irony dictates that Gary's reliance on his thermal layers and high-calorie rations only served to prolong his consciousness, forcing him to endure the sensory distortions of the black gash longer than a less prepared man would have. He was too fit to die quickly. He was forced to witness the total deconstruction of his reality. The technical term for this is sensory deprivation psychosis, but for the investigators staring at the macro shots of the buckle on that helmet, it felt like something more predatory. They found the metadata of the final GPS pulse again, and this time they looked at the elevation. It read 15,000 feet. Mount Sneffels is only 14,158 feet. For 3 minutes, the device believed Gary was standing nearly 1,000 feet in the air, suspended above the gash. GPS drift is common, but a vertical drift of that magnitude without a lateral shift is a forensic anomaly. It suggests a localized warping of the signal, or perhaps a final impossible ascent. The mountains keep their secrets, but they leave behind these digital scars to taunt those who seek the narrative truth. The evidence log was updated: 1 buckled helmet, 1 impossible elevation reading, and the lingering sound of a clicking tool. Why would he go to the edge? The question echoes through the sterile halls of the sheriff's office, a reminder that the San Juans do not just take lives, they take the logic that governs them. The grieving investigator, hunched over the light table, sees not just a map, but a series of traps laid by the terrain itself. Every strength was turned into a weakness. Every tool became a lie. The reconstruction now moves toward the final, most harrowing phase: the recovery of the remains and the forensic truth of what was found inside the terminal burrow. The final phase of the reconstruction began in September 2024, when the melting permafrost in the basin north of the Black Gash revealed the terminal burrow. It was not a cave or a crevice, but a shallow hand-dug depression beneath a slab of gray granite, reinforced with the remnants of Michael's emergency bivy bag and Gary's Gore-Tex shell. The forensic team moved with a reverent surgical slow burn. At 9:14 a.m., the first of the remains were identified. They were not where they were expected to be. The rule of irony reached its zenith here. The victims' superior physical fitness had allowed them to survive long enough for their bodies to become the final evidence logs of a biological catastrophe. Forensic analysis of the bone marrow and soft tissue indicated that Michael had survived for nearly 48 hours after the GoPro's last video. Gary had survived for 72. This was not a quick death by exposure. This was a 3-day siege. The discovery of the bodies provided the physical evidence needed to close the file, but the narrative truth remained fractured. Inside the burrow, the items were organized with obsessive, granular detail. Michael's boots were lined up side by side, laces tucked in. Gary's compass was placed exactly in the center of Michael's chest, its needle frozen by rust, pointing toward the Black Gash. No signal, no trace, just a meticulously curated grave. The grieving investigator noted that the internal pockets of their jackets were filled with small, smooth river stones, stones that did not belong in that high-altitude basin. They had been carried there. Why would they do this? Why would 2 men, freezing and broken, spend their final calories gathering stones from a different geological zone? The forensic casual explanation is pica, a symptom of extreme nutritional or psychological stress where the sufferer seeks to consume non-food items, but the stones were not swallowed. They were kept like talismans. At 11:30 a.m., the recovery team found the most disturbing piece of the evidence log: Gary's wedding ring. It had been hammered flat using the multi-tool and etched with a series of lines that mirrored the mountain wave audio patterns found on the GoPro. It was a physical transcription of a sound. The expert victim had spent his final hours trying to communicate with the frequency that had lured him to his death. Imagine you are lying in that dark, cold burrow, the wind screaming above you, and your only remaining strength is used to scratch the shape of that scream into a piece of gold. The mountains don't explain why Gary believed the sound had a shape. The final autopsy reports, released in early 2025, added one last layer of atmospheric mystery. Both men had significant amounts of quartz dust in their lungs, dust that was microscopically sharp, suggesting it had been inhaled during a high-velocity event, like a localized pressure drop or a volcanic vent, neither of which exist on Mount Sneffels. The impossible discovery of the dust suggested they weren't just breathing air, they were breathing the mountain itself. The forensic storyteller looks at the macro shots of the moss growing over the site and sees a closing door. The investigation concluded that Gary and Michael died of hypothermia exacerbated by high-altitude cerebral edema, but the open loop remains. The red X on the map, the vertical GPS drift, the clicking multi-tool, and the curated stones point to a reality that our technical terms cannot fully capture. We end with a moral warning. The wilderness is not a playground, and preparation is not a shield. It is a thin veil. When the mountains decide to keep a secret, they do not just take your life, they take your legacy, leaving only fragments of a story that can never be fully told. The mountains keep their secrets. The silence is the only truth left.